Welcome back to the Horizons Review. This will be a supplement to the previous episode I did with Cody on John Henry Newman's essay in aid of a grammar of assent. I want to cover some more things that we didn't cover thoroughly in the previous show, as well as respond to a fair piece of feedback I received. This episode will assume you've watched the previous show, so if you haven't and I introduce some unfamiliar concepts or terminology here, I'm sorry, but you'll just have to go back. The first thing I wanted to talk more about was Newman's theory of sentiments, which is scattered throughout the book. We briefly mentioned this in the previous show, but I feel like a more thorough treatment of it is good because it's one of the more difficult parts of the book for a lot of readers to accept. One thing that is clear about Newman's theory of sentiments is that he believes that there are some things you simply cannot understand without the proper sentiments. He says, I can understand the taste for speculation or betting found in great traders or on the turf if I am fond of enterprise or games of chance. But, on the other hand, not all the possible descriptions of headlong love will make me comprehend the delirium, if I had never had a fit of it, nor will ever so many sermons about the inward satisfaction of strict conscientiousness create in my mind the image of virtuous action and its attendant sentiments, if I have been brought up to lie, thieve, and indulge my appetites. Thus, we meet with men of the world who cannot enter into the very idea of devotion, and think, for instance, that from the nature of the case, a life of religious seclusion must be either one of unutterable dreariness or abandoned sensuality, because they know of no exercise of the affections but what is merely human. This seems to me to be both obviously correct, but also difficult to justify on any normal grounds, though it can be justified through the crude empiricism of believing one's own experience. However, it does end up involving abandoning some of the faith in the sufficiency of language, which often seems to be at the heart of the philosophical enterprise. What does it mean that if I cannot convince someone of what is virtuous unless they have cultivated the attendant moral sentiments? One of the best things I think that can be said for this form of argument, which I should add is not novel in Newman, is that it actually provides a good argument against moral relativism, even though people often think the opposite. If you accept the role of sentiments in this manner, the fact that people raised with very different moral codes find it difficult to adopt a new one isn't due to some more fundamental moral incommensurability or an incoherence of moral statements as such, but rather due to a more superficial one, operating on the level of the persons. This is a form of argument that people seem much more ready to accept when it comes to aesthetics. Plenty of persons who are realist about aesthetics accept that there's also some training of aesthetic sentiments necessary to prefer the beautiful to the merely amusing or so on. So why do we balk at this so much when it comes to morals? I'm inclined to think this is because of a specifically Christian hangover in our moral thinking. Morality comes with this baggage as being about ultimate judgments of the human person. And so it seems somehow unfair to condemn a person as evil or even just morally flawed if they were merely raised to have debased sentiments or suffered from some deficiency of the mind which prevented their formation. Only a strict believer in double predestination or their secular inheritor, comfortable with the idea that some are elect and some are not, could sit very easily with it. And for the Christian reader of Newman who's not partial to strict predestination, this theory becomes doubly troubling when it comes to the impulse to religion and overall openness to the religious life. While Newman does in places say that all persons are born with this religious impulse, which is something I am somewhat doubtful about, and are responsible for its deadening over time, it is also very possible to see the equivalent of Newman's man who is raised to lie, thieve, and indulge his appetites in the religious sense. Imagine a child raised strictly to see all religious impulses as an expression of primal irrationality, a sort of evolutionary backdoor in the human mind through which we are exploited by all sorts of charlatans. I really only have one suggestion to both the secular and religious listener troubled by these implications. For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required. The second thing I wanted to talk about was about the nature of real assent. I realized an important thing I had skipped over in our discussion of assent is that, for Newman, perhaps the archetypal case of real assent is that granted by young children to the statements of their parents. For Newman, the natural trust and love that children have for parents that results in them giving honest, real assent to their parents' assertions is not some exception to the rule of how we form assents, but actually the paradigmatic case, despite lacking those underlying layers of inference and experience that we see in adult assents. So for Newman, the trust that children exhibit here is actually necessary in some sense for all real assent. It's simply that adults come about this trust in a roundabout way. So we infer around the object, we grow confident in the assertion's use in navigating life, we grow to love a person, we grow to trust them, and so on. But children, they have this in a much more primal sense. So one thing I find really interesting about this is that it actually sets Newman somewhat apart from the long tradition in Western thought of trying to define some sort of age of reason in human development. What I mean by this is that for Newman, the cleavage is not so much between rationality and irrationality, but rather between this sort of freely given, implicit, and loving trust, but still rational, and the much more complex sorts of assents that we form as we get older. From a Christian perspective, it's obvious why this is immediately attractive, even if it's somewhat at odds with the age of reason concept. Because requiring the sort of complex inferential reasonings intelligent adults have as a bridge to a sense runs into serious difficulties in discussing to what degree, for example, the cognitively disabled can actually have faith. From a secular perspective, I believe this idea is still attractive because anyone with some epistemic humility can interrogate their deeply held beliefs and see how many of them rely on some form of fundamental trust. If not on authorities, then just on our innate capacities themselves. Though I've never met anyone who does not offer at least credence, if not assent, to some propositions on simple authority. It also makes some sense of a fact that Newman comes to again and again, which is that our inferential arguments which help lead us to an assent are just a sort of ladder, which we often find lacking in power once we actually arrive at the assent itself. Because once you have assent, you do sort of enter in back to that childlike state of having trust in that assent. I like that this doesn't treat children as irrational, but rather as imperfectly skeptical or perfectly unskeptical, and doesn't create such a sharp divide in immature and mature human belief as the age of reason concept often does. The last thing I want to address was my brief discussion of Zeno's paradoxes. One is because I didn't address a very important point about Zeno's paradoxes that I meant to address, and the other is the place that arguments in general have in Newman's scheme, something that I alluded to but didn't fully discuss. When I said that Zeno's paradoxes are hard to reject in their logical form, I meant that, but there are, of course, good objections to their premises. But the problem is that these objections only came with later mathematical discoveries that Zeno and his contemporaries did not anticipate. And often, even people aware of these discoveries haven't really internalized them, so they struggle to reject these paradoxes in any way other than the "I refute it thus" manner that I mentioned in the previous show. The example I meant to bring up of how you can reject the premises is, for example, once one knows the proof for how 0.999 repeating actually equals 1, or even less than that, just has some experience of limits in calculus, you can begin to see how Zeno's premises are flawed. But this argument leaves a little bit to be desired, and a friend of mine, Kevin Hawerkhorst, reminded me of a more thorough objection that had been presented by Bertrand Russell in the lectures collected as "Our Knowledge of the External World as a Field for Scientific Method and Philosophy." Before going on, I did reread these, and I want to note that these lectures are relatively short and have Russell's characteristic clarity, and they're also in the public domain, really worth reading. So Russell's point, which is premised on the discoveries of more recent mathematics, is that Zeno had simply misunderstood the nature of infinities and how, despite any series being compact, meaning that between any element there are infinite other elements, motion was not impossible. Another error that Zeno seemed to believe that from the position of any instant in time, objects of motion are at rest. So Russell objects to this definition of rest, saying that rest is instead the property of being in the same position over any number of instants in a certain period. And of course, we see how no matter how much we divide up time, an object in continuous motion will never be in the exact same position from each instant to the next. But the ancient Greek concept of number had these sort of discrete divisions that didn't allow for this sort of continuous series kind of thinking. Also worth considering here is the ancient Greek assumption against infinities entirely, which is a lesser known factor in their mathematics than the horror of the void. So why they would have rejected the concept of zero, which led to Zeno being able to easily reject our idea of continuity as it exists in modern mathematics. And Russell actually provides a good description of why even people who have knowledge of modern mathematics can still get tripped up by Zeno's paradoxes. He says, when a theory has been apprehended logically, there is often a long and serious labor still required in order to feel it. It is necessary to dwell upon it, to thrust out from the mind, one by one, the misleading suggestions of false but more familiar theories, to acquire the kind of intimacy which, in the case of a foreign language, would enable us to think and dream in it. And it's remarkable to me how compatible this is with things that Newman has to say in the grammar. Russell also admits that there's a further difficulty in proving that the mathematical theory applies to the world of experience, which would be an objection that, for example, a thoroughgoing Zenoist might want to give. He provides 3 arguments, but I'll only discuss 2 of them here because the third is mostly applicable as an argument against another alternative argument against Zeno, which I don't think is relevant to this discussion. So the first answer he calls the physiological answer, which poses that, okay, the appearance of the world could be expected to be what we experience if the mathematical theory is true. And the second is a kind of inverse, which he calls the psychological answer, which is that out of the materials provided to us by sensation, we could in fact construct a theory which has the same constructs as those proposed by mathematical theory, such as particles, points, instants. Even if these objects are merely mental constructs and do not name actual entities. And I think this is really important because sometimes people do get tripped up on this idea. Well, what if these various objects that we talk about actually don't name anything? Well, it kind of doesn't matter as long as they line up empirically and they work in the mathematics. There's no particularly strong reason for being a hard skeptic about the applicability of the theory to the real world. These arguments, I believe, are also compatible with Newman, but would be examples of why he seems to believe in places that there is no such thing as real assent to scientific truths. For example, that sort of roundabout reasoning about how the theory and the world line up, I don't think would satisfy him very much without some sort of authority or fiat behind it. As I mentioned in the previous show, I find this particular argument of Newman's to be unconvincing, and my only explanation for why he holds to it so strongly is because to do otherwise would undermine the apologetic thrust of the book. So there's this definite trend in the essay to preserve real assent for those propositions which you believe because you are in relation with some sort of loving agent that ensures you of them, such as a parent or, in Newman's case, also the Roman Catholic Church. However, I think it's very clear that people arrive at rational, real, and life-altering assents by other means, including by reading the book of nature and those who studied it themselves. Indeed, people arrive at them so deeply that they can inspire poetry. Consider as a final reflection here the poem Pelicans by Robertson Jeffers. 4 pelicans went over the house, sculled their worn oars over the courtyard. I saw that ungainliness magnifies the idea of strength. A lifting gale of seagulls followed them, slim yachts of the element, natural growths of the sky, no wonder. Light wings to leave sea, but those grave weights toil and are powerful. And the wings torn with old storms remember, the cone that the oldest redwood dropped from, the tilting of continents, the dinosaur's day, the life of new sea lines. The omnisecular spirit keeps the old with the new also. Nothing at all has suffered erasure. There is life not of our time. He calls ungainly bodies as beautiful as the grace of horses. He is weary of nothing. He watches airplanes. He watches pelicans. Some final housekeeping notes. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment. If you're listening to this anywhere other than Substack, please subscribe to the Horizons Review on horizonsreview.substack.com. I plan to leave the show completely free, but subscribing there is a way for you to engage and also to receive written updates and supplemental material. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave a review. For those of you who want to listen on Apple Podcasts, I've run into some difficulties. Apparently, if you have a developer account, you can't set up a podcast account. So I'm going to have to borrow someone else's account or sign up for a separate Apple ID. But once I get that done, I'll get the show up on Apple Podcasts as well. So thanks for listening. The next full episode, which will be another hour to 2 hour episode discussing a book, will be up in 2 to 4 days. We'll be discussing the book Zacord. And goodbye.